recall Krishnamurti and one of his talks that I listened to many months ago. I'm just recalling the point he made about our level of awareness and effort as well. And I just want to touch on the essence of what he was saying. He mentioned that, are we putting in the same amount of awareness in regards to healing our pain, understanding our fears, knowing who we are? Are we putting in the same amount of focus in comparison to other things in our lives? And this is a generalization of what he said. It's not a quote by any means, but if you were to lay out the contents of our life, if we had a very large corkboard as big as the wall, and we were to pin up all of the thoughts that we would go through each day, the amount of time we would spend in certain areas of our life, how much of that contents would be related to awareness, related to direct experience of the now, related to a self-inquiry of the thoughts that we identify with, inquiring about the identifier, the thinker of thoughts. Perhaps for some of us it's obvious, it's clear that we perhaps spend a lot of our time thinking about a certain area of our life. It could be family, it could be money, it could be our work. And it's not judging, it's not labeling anything as wrong, it's just observing this. It almost allows us to see how much time are we spending thinking about a certain area of our life or desires. Lust is a huge desire. Not just lusting after people, but belongings, a certain status. By doing this course, I'll get a piece of paper with my name on it with a title. And all of that effort, how much does that compare to the time and effort we are spending to heal ourselves, to heal our past pains, to transcend our thinking minds? And upon hearing this, it really touched me in a sense that in a few seconds it put things in perspective of, I didn't necessarily have to go through each area of my life, think, how much am I thinking or worrying about this area, or, but just the general sense of the time spent thinking about thoughts, worrying about things, versus the time spent, or the timeless amount of time, if it could be put in this way, spent in the present moment, and understanding the nature of who we are. And I think this was said in a way that perhaps somebody, maybe, I can imagine someone in the audience being frustrated. I'm trying to get to this awakened state, I'm trying to escape the effects of these thoughts. But how much time or how much awareness is actually going into this practice? Somebody may say these things, I'm not able to do this, I'm struggling. But if you were to lay out the contents of their lives, if you were to, empty the mind on the floor and look at the thoughts and look at the amount of identification happening there and the lack of practice or the lack of effort in cultivating presence, then maybe that's clear to see that, well, how much do you really want this? Sometimes we can fall in love with an idea, the idea of being free, the idea of being spiritual, the idea of transcending something. Sometimes that could be coloured in a way of achievement. Yes, I've crossed that difficult bridge. But what's the reality, though? What's the reality of our efforts? What's the reality in regards to our commitment to the practice, to our commitment to transcending, to knowing who we really are? And these words, commitment, effort, don't dwell on those too much. They're just simply some sort of pointers. Don't delve into that. Okay, what kind of effort? It's more of a. It's almost describing something that can't be described. But these words, are just there, almost as a rudder on a boat, just to steer you in a certain direction, in a certain way. And these things don't need to be thought about, by going through these questions. Immediately, the sense would, there's a certain sense you'd have that, wow, perhaps I'm not, spending time in the practice. And it's not to say you should be spending more time. Everyone is on their own path. For some people it may be accelerated. For others, acceleration can perhaps be damaging. So there isn't a one way to do this, or this must be done very quickly. This is all in the play of the now. Life is assisting you with this. It's by deep listening, you can almost understand when, yes, I need to perhaps immerse myself in more meditation and more practice. Or you may have the sense that, perhaps no formal practice is necessary at the moment. Perhaps life is enough practice where I can gently be present throughout my day. I don't need to set aside a block of time, an hour to be present. Perhaps this is, I'm not ready for this, or this is not for me in this time. So it's all about listening and inquiring about where you are in this moment. And that can be done through observation. But we are so conditioned that when we observe, it immediately turns into a judgment. There's commentary there. There's a few shoulds, or I wish I was able to do that. And it's just noticing that. It's almost sharpening the observation tool we have. At the moment it may be very blunt, it may be very objective, not subjective. we may get involved immediately in our observations, and that can colour the observation a certain way, where we're seeing less of what reality is, but seeing more of how our mind has shaped or perceives reality. And right observation is done from a point of neutrality, a point of centeredness, where there is no investment in the observation, that you're trying to shape it in a certain way to avoid pain, or it's just a very clear seeing. Oh, that's how it is. You may have just had a conversation with somebody, and immediately you can observe that, whoa, I wasn't very conscious in that conversation. There's no judgment in that, there's no blaming, there's just the awareness, there was no spaciousness in my replies, there was no deep listening to the person speaking to me. I was interrupting them, I was rushing what I was saying. But there's no I in that. There's no, I should have been more present, or why do I always interrupt? There's just an observation that, that's how it was. And you can even catch yourself, in the middle of it, of a practice where, your observation can start immediately. There's no delay. I've caught myself in conversations where suddenly I realise there's no spaciousness there. Then the moment the realisation arises, spaciousness is there. So I'll catch myself interrupting somebody, and then perhaps I will subtly smile at this. I think, I've kind of caught myself in the act of being unconscious, and then immediately you can, then there's spaciousness, and then when you realise you are not present, then you are. It automatically transitions into a different space. So I just wanted to just share that, that's what came to mind as I began the recording. And I thought I'd go straight into reading The Miracle of Mindfulness. The passage, the reading today, is titled, "The Water Clearer, the Grass Greener." The Buddha once said that the problem of life and death is itself the problem of mindfulness. Whether or not one is alive depends on whether one is mindful. In the Samyutta Nikaya Sutra, apologies for the pronunciation there, the Buddha tells a story which took place in a small village. A famous dancer had just come to the village, and the people were swimming the streets to catch a glimpse of her. At that same moment, a condemned criminal was obliged to cross the village, carrying a bowl of oil filled to the very brim. He had to concentrate with all his might on keeping the bowl steady, for even if one drop of oil were to spill from the bowl to the ground, the soldier directly behind him had orders to take out his sword and cut off the man's head. Having reached this point in the story, Gautama Buddha asked, "Now, do you think our prisoner was able to keep all his attention so focused on the bowl of oil that his mind did not stray to steal a glimpse of the famous dancer in town, or to look up at the throngs of villagers making such a commotion in the streets, any of whom could bump into him at any moment. Another time the Buddha recounted a story which made me suddenly see the supreme importance of practicing mindfulness of one's own self, that is, to protect and care for one's self, not being preoccupied about the way others look after themselves, a habit of mind which gives rise to resentment and anxiety. The Buddha said, "There once were a couple of acrobats. The teacher was a poor widower, and the student was a small girl named Medha. The two of them performed in the streets to earn enough to eat. They used a tall bamboo pole which the teacher balanced on the top of his head, while the little girl slowly climbed to the top. There she remained while the teacher continued to walk along the ground. Both of them had to devote all their attention to maintain perfect balance and to prevent any accident from occurring. One day the teacher instructed the pupil, 'Listen, Medha, I will watch you and you watch me, so that we can help each other maintain concentration and balance and prevent an accident. Then we'll be sure to earn enough to eat.' But the little girl was wise and answered, 'Dear Master, I think it would be better for each of us to watch ourselves. To look after oneself means to look after both of us. That way, I am sure we will avoid any accidents and will earn enough to eat.' The Buddha said, 'The child spoke correctly.' In a family, if there is one person who practices mindfulness, the entire family will be more mindful. Because of the presence of one member who lives in mindfulness, the entire family is reminded to live in mindfulness. If in one class, one student lives in mindfulness, the entire class is influenced. In peace-serving communities, we must follow the same principle. Don't worry if those around you aren't doing their best. Just worry about how to make yourself worthy. Doing your best is the surest way to remind those around you to do their best. But to be worthy requires the continuing practice of mindfulness. That is a certainty. Only by practicing mindfulness will we not lose ourselves, but acquire a bright joy and peace. Only by practicing mindfulness will we be able to look at everyone else with the open mind and eyes of love. I was just invited downstairs for a cup of tea into an apartment where a friend who helps us has a piano. As Kirsten, who is from Holland, poured tea for me, I looked at her pile of work and said, "Why don't you stop translating orphan applications for a minute and play the piano for me?" Kirsten was glad to put down her work for a moment and sat down at the piano to play a selection of Chopin she has known since she was a child. I think that's pronounced Chopin, I think. I may be completely wrong. The piece has several measures which are soft and melodic, but others which are loud and quick. Her dog was lying beneath the tea table, and when the music became excited, it began to bark and whine. I knew that it felt uneasy and wanted the music to stop. Kirsten's dog is treated with the kindness one gives to a small child, and perhaps is more sensitive to music than most children. Or perhaps it responded this way because its ears pick up certain vibrations that human ears do not. Kirsten continued to play while trying to console the dog at the same time, but to no avail. She finished and began to play another piece by Mozart, which was light and harmonious. Now the dog lay quietly and appeared to be at peace. When Kirsten had finished, she came over and sat down beside me and said, "Often, when I play a piece of Chopin that is the least bit loud, the dog comes and grabs hold of my pants leg, trying to force me to leave the piano. Sometimes I have to put her outside before I can continue playing. But whenever I play Bach or Mozart, she is peaceful." Kirsten mentioned a report that in Canada people tried playing Mozart for their plants during the night. The plant grew more quickly than normal, and the flowers inclined towards the direction of the music. Others played Mozart every day in wheat and rye fields, and were able to measure that the wheat and rye in these fields grew more quickly than the wheat and rye in other fields. As Kirsten spoke, I thought about conference rooms where people argue and debate, where angry and reproachful words are hurled back and forth. If one placed flowers and plants in such rooms, chances are they would cease to grow. I thought about the garden tended by a monk living in mindfulness. His flowers are always fresh and green, nourished by the peace and joy which flow from his mindfulness. One of the ancients said, "When a great master is born, the water in the rivers turns clearer and the plants grow greener." We ought to listen to music or sit and practice breathing at the beginning of every meeting or discussion. So that is the end of that passage, and I will end the episode here as well, and we can perhaps, for a few, if you have a few moments after this episode, just dwell upon the stories we heard about taking care of ourselves in order to take care of others. So we read a few examples illustrating this point that Tai has made. And perhaps before this episode ends, we can just allow what we've heard to settle in us as well, just for a few moments. Not having to remember what we've read, but just feel what we've absorbed. Just connect with that sensation, what's been cultivated here in this moment. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I wish you well in this moment as always, and I'll speak to you again very soon.